You told yourself you'd stop losing your temper. You lost it twice this week. You swore you'd silence the self-criticism. It got louder. You promised yourself you'd stop procrastinating by shaming yourself into starting. You're procrastinating right now, mid-shame, watching this instead. Here's what nobody tells you. The war itself is what's feeding it. Not slowly, not by accident, directly. The same energy you spend attacking a part of yourself is the energy that part uses to grow louder, sneakier, and harder to control. This is the paradox we're going to sit inside of for the next half hour. What you try to destroy in yourself doesn't disappear. It doesn't even weaken. It goes underground, learns your patterns, and starts running your life from a place you can't see or negotiate with, because you declared war on it instead of understanding it. Think about the trait you've spent the most energy trying to eliminate. Maybe it's anger. Maybe it's the part of you that needs approval so badly it makes you say yes when you mean no. Maybe it's laziness or weakness, or the part that sabotages good things right when they start going well. You've called it the enemy. You've punished it with shame, tried to out-discipline it, tried to think your way out of it at 2 a.m. with enough willpower to finally make it behave. And it hasn't worked. Not permanently. It comes back, usually stronger, usually at the worst possible moment, right when you thought you'd finally beaten it. There's a reason for that. And it isn't a character flaw. It's a mechanism, and it's been documented with enough precision that you'll be able to test it against your own life before this video is over. Every part of you that you've tried to destroy has been getting stronger from the fight, not weaker. And once you understand why, you'll never fight yourself the same way again. Here's the part that's going to be uncomfortable to hear, so I'll say it plainly instead of softening it. The trait you hate most about yourself right now is not your enemy. It's something else entirely. And you've been at war with it for so long, you've forgotten to ask what it's actually trying to do. Most self-improvement content will not tell you this, because it's easier to sell you a war than a negotiation. Kill the bad habit. Crush the weakness. Destroy the part of you that's holding you back. It sounds strong. It sounds like the kind of advice that separates people who succeed from people who don't. And it is provably wrong for an entire category of what you're trying to fix. The category this video is about to name with precision, not vague encouragement. By the end of this, you'll know exactly which parts of yourself respond to discipline and which ones respond to something else entirely, and you'll understand why using the wrong tool on the wrong part has been quietly making things worse the whole time you thought you were making them better. Here's the uncomfortable question underneath everything we just described. What if the part of you that you're fighting isn't malfunctioning? What if it's doing exactly what it was built to do, and the fight itself is what's making it worse? That sounds like an excuse to stop trying. It isn't. Stay with the logic. When you decide a part of yourself is the enemy, the anger, the neediness, the procrastination, the self-sabotage, you're not neutralizing it. You're doing something specific to your own attention. You're forcing your mind to monitor for it constantly, scanning for its appearance so you can suppress it the moment it shows up. And monitoring for something is not the same as being free of it. It's the opposite. It's keeping the thing loaded in the front of your mind at all times, disguised as vigilance. Psychologists call this ironic process theory, and it was demonstrated with almost comic precision. Researcher Daniel Wegner ran an experiment where he asked participants to do one simple thing. For 5 minutes, do not think about a white bear. Ring a bell every time the thought intrudes. People rang that bell constantly, far more than a control group who'd simply been asked to think about a white bear freely. The instruction to suppress the thought made the thought appear more, not less. Wegner's explanation was elegant. To successfully avoid thinking about something, part of your mind has to keep checking whether you're thinking about it. That checking process requires holding the very thing you're avoiding in active memory. The suppression machinery and the thing being suppressed can't be separated. They run on the same circuit. Translate that from a lab experiment into your actual life. Every time you tell yourself, "Don't be angry," some part of your mind has to monitor for anger in order to catch it and shut it down, which means anger stays active just below the surface instead of dissolving. Every time you shame the procrastinating part of you into silence, you're not removing the impulse to avoid the task. You're adding a second impulse, the urge to avoid the shame, on top of the first one. Now you're not managing one difficult feeling. You're managing two, and the second one is entirely self-inflicted. This is the first crack in the story you've been told about self-improvement. The idea that identifying your flaw and attacking it with enough discipline is how change happens. For certain things, that story holds. Skills, habits, concrete behaviors you can practice your way into. But for the parts of you that carry emotion, memory, or fear, the anger, the neediness, the self-sabotage, attack doesn't produce discipline. It produces an underground war that never actually ends, because the part being attacked doesn't have anywhere else to go. It just gets better at hiding. Notice the difference in how these two categories respond to force. Push harder on a skill gap, and within limits you get better. Practice compounds. Push harder on a protective part, and it doesn't compound the same way. It compounds resistance instead, because you're not building capability. You're escalating a conflict with something that has its own agenda, however outdated that agenda might be. Mistaking one category for the other is the single most common error in how people approach self-improvement, and it's rarely named this directly. Here's the distinction that matters, and it's one almost nobody makes explicitly. There's a difference between a behavior and a part. A behavior is something you do. A part is something in you that's driving the behavior, usually for a reason it developed a long time ago. You can discipline a behavior. Go to the gym, write the report, show up on time. You cannot discipline a part the same way, because a part isn't lazy or broken. It's operating on old information, running a strategy that made sense once and never got updated. Treating a part like a behavior, trying to out-willpower it, is like trying to fix outdated software by yelling at the screen. The code doesn't change because you're loud. It changes because someone finally goes in and edits it. There's a second layer to the suppression research worth naming, because it explains why the attack strategy feels so convincing in the moment, even as it fails. Wegener's later work found that suppression doesn't just fail neutrally, it produces what he called a rebound effect. Once the suppression effort ends, even briefly, the suppressed thought or feeling doesn't just return to baseline. It spikes, often higher than it would have been if you'd never suppressed it at all. This is why the trait you fought hardest doesn't just persist. It tends to erupt at the exact moments your guard is down. Exhaustion, stress, the end of a long day when the willpower reserves you were using to hold the part back finally run dry. That eruption isn't a sign of weak character. It's the predictable, measurable cost of a suppression strategy finally running out of fuel. Which raises the real question this video needs to answer. If the part you're fighting isn't malfunctioning, what is it actually doing? Why would any part of you produce anger, or neediness, or self-sabotage, unless some piece of that behavior was, at some point, protecting you from something worse? Let's ground this in something you can test, not just feel. Family therapist and researcher Richard Schwartz spent decades working with clients whose lives were run by exactly the parts they hated most: explosive anger, compulsive people-pleasing, self-destructive spirals. What he found repeatedly changed how an entire field thinks about internal conflict. Every one of those bad parts, when given enough safety to actually be listened to instead of attacked, turned out to be doing a job. The anger wasn't random violence. It was a guard, protecting a much more vulnerable part of the person from ever being hurt or humiliated again the way they'd once been hurt or humiliated. The compulsive people-pleasing wasn't weakness. It was a strategy, built in childhood to keep a volatile parent calm, and it had simply never gotten the update that the danger was over. Schwartz's model, now used clinically worldwide, is built on a claim that sounds almost too simple until you test it against your own patterns. There are no bad parts. There are only parts carrying jobs that made sense once, still running on outdated instructions. Sit with that for a second, because it reframes everything. The part of you that sabotages good things right when they start going well isn't trying to ruin your life. Somewhere it learned that good things get taken away, and it decided the safest move is to end things on your terms before they can be ended on someone else's. That's not malfunction. That's protection, running an old, outdated script. And here's the detail that matters most. Parts that are attacked don't hand over their job. They dig in and defend it harder, the same way any protector escalates when the thing it's protecting seems more threatened, not less. This shows up outside the therapy room too, in patterns large enough that entire fields of research have been built around them. Look at how addiction recovery programs shifted over the past several decades, moving away from models built on shame and willpower alone, toward models built on understanding what function the addictive behavior was actually serving. Clinicians working in that field describe the shift consistently. Programs built around punishing the addicted part of a person tend to produce worse long-term outcomes than programs that ask what the addiction was protecting the person from in the first place. Isolation, unprocessed grief, unbearable anxiety, and address that underlying need directly. Stop and notice something for a moment. What's the part of you that you've been most ashamed of? The one you'd never say out loud in a room full of people. Now ask a harder question, not how do I get rid of it, but what is it trying to protect me from? Sit with that question longer than feels comfortable. The answer is rarely obvious on the first pass. Sometimes it takes several honest attempts before the real answer surfaces underneath the first, easier one you offer yourself. This same pattern shows up historically at a larger scale too, in how entire cultures have handled the parts of human nature they've decided are shameful. Look at how emotional suppression was treated across much of 20th century Western culture. Anger discouraged, grief privatized, vulnerability treated as weakness to be managed rather than felt. What clinicians observed in the decades that followed wasn't emotional problems disappearing. It was those problems relocating into anxiety disorders, into psychosomatic illness, into the very explosive outbursts that suppression was supposed to prevent in the first place. It's a pattern, not a single study, but it's a pattern that shows up at every scale we can observe it: individual, clinical, and cultural. What gets attacked doesn't vanish. It goes underground and comes back louder, usually in a form harder to recognize than the original. There's a specific finding worth naming directly, because it removes any ambiguity about whether this is opinion or documented pattern. Psychologist James Gross, whose lab work shaped how the field understands emotion regulation, found in controlled studies that people instructed to suppress a negative emotion in the moment don't just fail to reduce their distress. They show heightened physiological arousal compared to people who were allowed to express or simply acknowledge the same emotion. Elevated heart rate, elevated stress hormone markers. The suppression strategy that feels subjectively like control is measurably costing the body more than the feeling it was trying to contain. You're not saving energy by shutting the part down. You're spending more of it, just less visibly. There's also a social cost to this that's easy to miss because it happens outside the person doing the suppressing. In a related study out of the same research line, suppressing your own emotional reaction during a difficult conversation didn't just cost the suppressor internally, it raised the blood pressure of the other person in the conversation too, even though they couldn't consciously identify what was off. Something about a suppressed emotional signal reads at a level below awareness as incongruent or untrustworthy, and other people's nervous systems pick up on that incongruence even when their conscious mind can't name it. The war you're fighting privately doesn't stay private. It leaks into every room you carry it into. Sit with that for a second, because it dismantles a belief most of us were never told we were carrying. The idea that a calm surface means an efficient internal system. Often it means the opposite. The calmest-looking person in the room may be running the most expensive internal war, all of it invisible, all of it billed directly to their nervous system, whether anyone else can see the transaction or not. Here's a specific case that makes this less abstract. Consider how differently two people can handle the exact same intrusive thought. Say, a sudden fear of failing publicly. One treats the fear as an enemy to be crushed the moment it appears, white-knuckling through every meeting, every deadline, doubling down on control the instant the fear shows its face. The other treats the same fear as information, asks what it's actually flagging. Maybe a genuine gap in preparation, maybe an old wound about being humiliated once, long ago, in front of people who mattered. The first person's fear tends to compound over time, showing up in more situations more intensely, because it's never been resolved, only suppressed. The second person's fear, once actually examined, often turns out to be pointing at something specific and addressable, and once addressed, it quiets down on its own, without a single act of willpower spent fighting it. So here's the deeper question this evidence forces open. If every part you're fighting is actually trying to protect you from something old, something that may not even be true anymore, why does attacking it feel so justified in the moment? Why does the war feel like the responsible thing to do, even while it keeps failing? Let's make this concrete, because there is almost certainly a specific part of you this video has already brought to mind. Here's how to find it precisely. Think of the trait you criticize in yourself the fastest, the one that gets a reflexive internal insult. The second it shows up, there I go again, why can't I just stop? What is wrong with me? That reflex, that speed of self-attack, is the tell. It means this part has been on your most wanted list for a long time. Now ask the Schwartz question, slowly, without rushing to an answer. What is this part protecting me from? If it's anger, what would happen if the anger weren't there? What old vulnerability would be left exposed? If it's people-pleasing, what specifically did it once keep you safe from? And is that danger still actually present in your life today? Or is the part simply still running the old alarm? If it's procrastination, what is it protecting you from feeling failure before you've even tried? Or the disappointment of trying your hardest and it still not being enough? This is where most people flinch, because the honest answer is usually smaller and older than expected. It's rarely, I procrastinate because I'm lazy. It's closer to, I procrastinate because if I never fully try, I never have to find out I'm not good enough. And that fear is often decades old, formed long before the current stakes even existed. Here's the distinction that changes everything about how you relate to this part going forward. You are not required to keep the outdated strategy. You are allowed to thank the part for what it was trying to do, and then have an honest conversation with it about whether the danger it's guarding against is actually still here. That conversation sounds almost too simple to work, and it is simple. Simple is not the same as easy, but it does something attack never could. It gives the part a reason to stand down instead of a reason to dig in. Try this literally, not as metaphor. Next time the trait shows up, the anger, the people-pleasing, the procrastination, instead of the reflexive internal insult, try asking it directly, what are you afraid will happen if you stop? Then wait. The answer that surfaces, even if it feels strange to receive it this way, is almost always more honest than anything years of self-criticism produced. Write it down if it helps. Some people find the answer arrives more clearly on paper than in their head, where the old self-critical voice tends to talk over anything quieter trying to speak. This won't feel natural at first, and it shouldn't. You've spent years, maybe decades, treating this part as an intruder to be expelled, rather than a member of your own internal system that's been doing an old job with outdated information. Relearning that relationship takes repetition, not a single insight. But the repetition works differently than the fight did, because instead of reinforcing the war, every honest conversation with the part reinforces the exact thing that makes it finally willing to update. There's a boundary worth drawing here, because otherwise this idea gets misused. Understanding a part is not the same as excusing every behavior that part produces. If the anger is protecting an old wound, but is currently damaging a relationship you value, both things are true at once. The anger deserves to be understood, and the way it's currently being expressed still needs to change. Compassion for the part's origin doesn't mean unlimited permission for its current behavior. What changes is how you address the behavior, not through shame, which the part reads as further proof of danger, but through a direct, respectful conversation that says, in effect, I hear what you're trying to protect me from, and here's a way to do that job that doesn't cost me a relationship I care about. That distinction, separating the part's original protective function from its current, sometimes outdated expression, is the actual skill this entire video is trying to teach you. It's harder than either pure attack or pure permissiveness, because it requires you to hold two things simultaneously: respect for the part's history and clarity about what needs to change in its present behavior. Most people only learned the attack option. Almost nobody taught you this one. Here's a practical marker to know you're doing this correctly, not just performing self-compassion as a new costume for the same old avoidance. After the conversation with the part, does the underlying behavior actually shift, even slightly, even slower than you'd like? Or does nothing change except your language about it? Real understanding produces real movement over time, even if it's not instant. If weeks pass, and the trait is exactly as intense as before with no change at all, that's worth investigating honestly. Either the question wasn't asked with real openness, or there's a deeper layer underneath the first answer that hasn't been reached yet. Part's work is rarely a single conversation. It's a practice, the same way any relationship is a practice, not a transaction you complete once and never revisit. One more thing worth saying plainly: this process is not therapy, and for parts carrying serious trauma, Working with a trained professional matters more than anything a video can walk you through alone. What this video can give you is the reframe, the understanding that the part isn't the enemy, and a starting practice for the smaller everyday versions of this pattern. For the deeper wounds, that reframe is still the right first step. It's just not always the last one. But knowing this and living it are two different animals, because there's a deeper reason the attack strategy is so hard to abandon. And it has less to do with the part you're fighting than with what fighting it has been quietly doing for your own sense of control. Here is the layer underneath the layer. Fighting a part of yourself isn't just ineffective, it's expensive, in a very specific and measurable way. Because a part under attack doesn't just sit quietly and absorb the damage, it escalates. This is one of the most consistent findings across the parts work and suppression research. Pressure applied to an internal part tends to increase, not decrease, the intensity and frequency of what that part produces. The anger you shame gets sharper. The neediness you punish gets more desperate. The procrastination you berate gets more paralyzing. You're not disciplining the part into submission. You're locked in an arms race with a piece of your own mind, and arms races don't end in surrender. They end in escalation on both sides, indefinitely. Ask yourself honestly, right now, has the trait you fought the hardest actually gotten smaller over the years? Or has it just gotten better at hiding until you're too depleted to catch it? Here's what that escalation is actually costing you, and it's rarely counted correctly. People count the moments the part wins, the outburst, the people-pleasing yes they regret, the day lost to procrastination. What they don't count is the constant low-grade vigilance required to keep the war running at all. The internal monitoring, the preemptive self-criticism, the exhausting habit of bracing for the part to show up before it even has. That vigilance runs in the background of your entire life, whether the part is currently active or not, because a system at war never fully stands down. It just waits for the next skirmish. Stop and count for a moment. How many hours this week you've spent bracing for this part to show up? Not dealing with it, just bracing. That number is usually far higher than the number of times the part actually appeared. Now here's the part that reframes everything. When a part is genuinely heard instead of attacked, when you actually ask what it's protecting you from, and take that answer seriously instead of shaming it out of existence, something specific happens. The part doesn't need to escalate anymore, because escalation was never the goal. It was the only tool available to a part that had never once been listened to. A guard that's finally relieved of duty doesn't need to shout. It can rest, because someone finally noticed it was standing there in the first place. This is the actual mechanism behind the title of this video. What you try to destroy consumes you not out of spite, but out of necessity. A part fighting for its survival, using the only strategy available to something that's never been understood, will always escalate against an attacker. The moment the attack stops and understanding starts, the part's entire reason for escalating disappears. Not because you won the fight, because there was never actually anything to fight. There was only something that needed to be heard. I want to be honest about the limits of this, because a channel that only tells you the flattering version eventually loses your trust. This isn't a single conversation, and the trait vanishes overnight. Parts that have been running old protective scripts for decades don't update instantly just because you asked them one good question. Some traits, especially ones tied to real ongoing circumstances rather than outdated fear, may never fully disappear. And that's not failure. That's a part correctly reading a situation that still, in some way, warrants its vigilance. The goal was never elimination. It was relationship. A part you understand, even one that still shows up sometimes, costs you far less than a part you're permanently at war with. There's a reason this reframe is harder to accept than the attack strategy, even once the logic is clear. Attack feels like agency. It feels like you're doing something, taking a stand, refusing to be run by a weakness. Relationship feels slower, less dramatic, less like a victory you can point to. But the evidence doesn't reward drama. It rewards what actually reduces the frequency and intensity of the behavior over time. And across every domain we've looked at tonight, from suppressed thought to suppressed emotion to suppressed trauma response, the pattern holds in the same direction. Understanding outperforms elimination every time it's been measured carefully enough to compare the two. Think about what this means for the specific trait you identified earlier in this video. If you've spent years fighting it and it's still here, the fight was never going to be the thing that ended it. Not because you didn't try hard enough, but because effort was never the missing ingredient. Information was. The part was waiting the entire time for someone to ask what it needed, instead of demanding it disappear. There's one more piece of this worth naming before we move forward, because it closes a loop the earlier research opened. Remember the white bear, the way suppression made the unwanted thought appear more, not less. The same logic runs underneath every part you've been fighting. The instruction "stop being angry" requires ongoing monitoring for anger, which keeps anger active. The instruction "understand what the anger is protecting" requires a completely different kind of attention, not vigilance against the part, but curiosity toward it. Curiosity doesn't create the rebound effect suppression does, because curiosity isn't a form of resistance. It's the opposite. And a part meeting curiosity instead of resistance for the first time in years tends to do something suppression never once achieved. It settles. That's not a smaller promise than just destroy the bad habit. It's a truer one. And it's the only version of this that actually holds up once you've tested it against your own life, instead of just against a single motivated Monday morning. I want to talk to you directly for a moment, because statistically, if you've watched this far, you already know which part of yourself this video has been describing. I'll be honest with you, I had a part like this for years, the one that sabotaged things the moment they started going well. I called it self-destructive. I punished it, tried to outplan it, tried to shame it into behaving whenever I felt it show up. It took me a long time to ask it a single honest question instead of another insult. And when I finally did, the answer surprised me. It wasn't trying to destroy anything. It was trying to make sure I never got blindsided by losing something good again. It had been protecting me the entire time, in the clumsiest way it knew how. You know which part this video has been pointing at for you. You've known since the first minute, even if you didn't let yourself fully admit it while the explanation was running. Maybe it's the anger that shows up faster than you'd like. Maybe it's the need for approval that makes you say yes when your whole body is saying no. Maybe it's the procrastination or the part that pulls the plug right when things start to matter most. Here's what I actually want you to sit with quietly, not as a task to complete, but as a question to hold. What has the war with this part already cost you? Not what the part itself has cost. The war, the years of self-attack, the energy spent monitoring for it, dreading it, punishing yourself after it showed up anyway. That cost is real, and it's rarely the number people expect when they finally add it up honestly. Some of you have been carrying this fight since childhood, and it stopped feeling like a fight at all. It just feels like who you are. That's how deeply an old war can bury itself. It stops looking like conflict and starts looking like personality. If that's true for you, I want to say this clearly. The part you've been calling your worst trait might be the oldest, hardest working protector you have, and it deserves a conversation before it deserves another round of shame. There is another way to hold this part. Not surrender to it, not letting it run unchecked. A third option nobody taught you, because most of what you were taught about self-improvement was built entirely around attack. I'm not asking you to trust this because it sounds compassionate. Compassion isn't the point here. Accuracy is. The part you've been fighting has been giving you real information the whole time, just encoded in a form you were never taught to read. Learning to read it isn't softness. It's precision. The same precision this whole channel is built around. You don't get to change something you refuse to understand. You only get to suppress it temporarily and pay for that suppression later, usually at a worse moment than the one you avoided. Let's return to where we started. You told yourself you'd stop losing your temper, stop needing approval, stop procrastinating, and the war never actually worked, no matter how much discipline you threw at it. We asked at the beginning why the thing you fight hardest seems to survive every attack, stronger each time. Now you know why. It was never malfunctioning. It was protecting you, using the only strategy available to a part that had never once been asked what it actually needed. Every attack confirmed to that part that the threat was real, and every confirmation made it dig in harder. The war wasn't failing by accident. It was failing by design, because you can't out-discipline something whose entire purpose is to keep you safe from a danger it still believes is present. Here's the layer this video hasn't said yet. the one that changes how you'll think about every future flaw you catch in yourself. The trait you hate most about yourself has never been the enemy. The war was. And the moment you understand that, the entire fight you've been having with your own mind for years stops needing a winner, because it was never actually a fight between you and something bad. It was a conversation you hadn't had yet with a part of you that had been waiting this whole time simply to be asked. This doesn't mean every part of you deserves endless patience regardless of the cost to your life or the people around you. It means the starting point changes. You start from curiosity instead of contempt. And you'll find almost every time that curiosity gets you further in a month than contempt got you in years. Once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. Every future moment you catch yourself reaching for self-attack, you'll be able to ask the sharper question instead. What is this part trying to protect me from? And is that danger even still here? That single distinction, the one this entire video has been building toward, is worth more than any amount of self-discipline ever was. Not because discipline is worthless, because you were pointing it at the wrong target the entire time, and no amount of force fixes a targeting problem. The war is over the moment you decide it doesn't need to be a war. Not because the part stops mattering, but because it finally has somewhere to put its energy other than defense. If there's one part of yourself this video pulled into focus, put it in the comments in 5 words or less. I've been fighting me key. Naming it honestly is the first real conversation you can have with it. And if this way of seeing things shifted something in you, subscribing here isn't about the algorithm. It's a small contract with the version of you that's learning to listen to itself instead of attacking itself. Every week, one more piece of the mechanism. If today's idea that the parts of you you've been fighting were never the enemy is one you want to sit with more deeply, there's a companion piece that goes further into exactly how this internal shift works day to day. It's laid out in a short ebook, quietly pinned in the comments below this video. Worth a slow read if this is a pattern you keep circling back to in your own life. And if today made you look at your own self-criticism differently, tomorrow's video takes this even further, into the specific state most people never dare to actually practice, because it looks like the opposite of caring when it's really the opposite of control. It's called Why Indifference is a Weapon. And if today unsettled something useful in you, that one will too. Stop fighting it. Start asking it.